welcome. I can see lots of people entering the webinar. It's great to see you. Well, not see you, but it's great to have you here. Wow, great. Some familiar names. Welcome, everyone. I'll just give everyone a few more minutes to finish logging on. Welcome if you've just logged on. We're really excited to have Dr. Adrian Field and Jen Reichert presenting this evening. We'll just wait 1 or 2 more minutes for any more people ready logging on. Kim, you have your hand up. We will be explaining a few things at the start. So if you have any questions, just call, thanks Kim, just pop them in the chat box, but we'll get to that in a sec. Okay. All right. Well, haere mai, welcome everybody. We're going to get started now. Tēnā koe Jen, tēnā koe Adrian, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai haere mai ki tēnei wānanga ipurangi, ko Rachel Foxall toku ingoa. Hello Jen, hello Adrian. We are welcoming you to present this evening. Welcome everyone to this webinar, coordinated by the Music Therapy New Zealand Research SIG, which is their special interest group. I'm Rachel Foxall, I'm a registered music therapist in Auckland, and we are wanting to thank all the people who've worked hard to put this webinar together, and particularly the webinar series leading up to Music Therapy Week. So we give thanks to Alison Talmage, coordinator of the Research SIG, and Emily Hunt, also Jenny Gordon, Lara Burke, Lisa Stanley, and the Music Therapy New Zealand Council. During this webinar, all attendees will be muted, so if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. There is also a Q&A function which we will be checking, but mostly we will keep to the chat. You can also raise your hand if you need to ask something urgently, but we prefer that you use the chat. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So just a few, we'll just introduce our presenters tonight. Jen Reichert is the Clinical and Centre Director of the Rokotori Music Therapy Centre. During her time as Director, Rokotori has realised unprecedented growth and currently serves over 500 clients across the lifespan each week. Jen joined the Rokotori team in 2015 following work as the Music Therapy Clinic Manager and Visiting Assistant Clinical Professor of Music Therapy at Nazareth College in Rochester. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you.
Dr. Adrian Field is a trained social science researcher and director of Dovetail, an Auckland-based research and evaluation company. Adrian's work helps organisations uncover the difference that they are making and supports positive change in communities and systems. The title of their presentation is Keeping Community in Mind, evaluating how a music therapy service is valued by its community. I know we're all muted, but please join me in welcoming Jen and Adrian. Tēnā kōrua.
Thanks. Okay. Jen, do you want to kick off with a welcome and then before I do the slides? Or do you want me to?
I'll jump in. We don't have a lot of time.
Okay, all right, I'll get going. Well, kia ora tātou. Ko Purongia toku maunga, ko Waikato toku awa, no kirikiriroa ahau, he Pākehā ahau, ko Adrian Field taku ingoa. Thank you very much for having me along tonight. It really has been a privilege to be part of this research. And Jen and I together are going to present the findings from an evaluation that Dovetail led over about a 15-month period, looking at the value and impacts that Rokotōri is having with its client group and the families in whānau that are part of their network. It really was a labour of love for us to be part of it. And I do want to acknowledge before I start just that the funding that was provided for this research by the Lotteries Commission, and this is now available also on the Community Research website. The families who took part in the evaluation as well, they really gave a lot of time and passion in taking part, as did the outreach partners who we were able to engage with. I'd also like to acknowledge the Rokotōri staff, especially Jen and Ollie, who we worked very closely with as the evaluation unfolded. And lastly, to the Trust, Rokotōri Music Therapy Trust, for commissioning this work. So I'll start putting the slide deck up, and hopefully technology will work well and we'll be okay. Okay, I think that's looking good. Thanks, Jen. So yeah, we've titled this Keeping Community in Mind and Evaluating How Our Music Therapy Service is Valued by Its Community. And the subtitle for me with this was something that came out of a quote from a participant in the research, who talked about their child as moving from closed to flowering. And I think that really typified the changes that music therapy was able to bring about in those participating, and the sense of value that they had of being part of music therapy. What we're going to talk about is a little bit of background to the research and why it was commissioned. I'll try to take a little bit of time, but not too much, to talk about the approach and the methods, and really try and spend some time on things like the value and impacts of Rokotōri, the factors that sustain and challenge participation, and also look at reflections from the Enabling Good Lives initiative, which is guiding a lot of thinking in the disability sector at the moment, and the parallels that the work of Rokotōri may well have with Enabling Good Lives. And lastly, Jen will cover reflections for Rokotōri and the wider profession that have come out of this evaluation.
So Rokotōri embarked on this evaluation process in late 2018, and that was really for a number of reasons, both internal within the trust and also some external things that were happening that I could sense around us. So internally, I didn't feel like the service evaluation process that was in place at Rokotōri was providing enough or the right kind of information that we needed to really evaluate our service. Every 6 months or so, when we completed a review meeting with a family or with an outreach partner, we asked them to fill in a paper evaluation form to tell us how we were doing. Due to the cumbersome process of having to print that and scan it, not many evaluations were returned, and the ones that were came from highly motivated parents, and they tended to be really glowing. So they didn't provide opportunities for us for improvement and for growth. I also had this sense that from time to time families left Rokotōri without being completely straightforward with us as to the reason. So it might have been a lack of fit with a therapist. They weren't sure that their child was making progress. The costs were a burden for their family, but they didn't want to hurt our feelings. They didn't want to rock the boat. So they weren't really forthcoming about why they were choosing to leave us. Also in 2018, what happened was we reached a kind of benchmark where for the first time, less than 50% of our services were being offered at our primary center. And so part of this corresponded with our start with opening our regional centers, first in Hawke's Bay and then in Northland. So the regional center and the outreach development meant that I was less connected to many of our families. And I felt unsure that we were meeting their needs or that they felt comfortable providing feedback, as they weren't as connected with myself and the rest of our admin team as they would have been in the past. And this was particularly true in the regions. And we've come to find out that there are quite specific needs in Northland and Hawke's Bay that are different from Auckland too, and we wanted to have a better way to reach out to those people and understand them. I often found that I was also citing information on value that we provided beyond our direct services when I was writing grant applications and communications with our donors. So I might have, you know, having conversations with parents, realized the parents valued the homeliness of the center, that our services provided respite, that family and client friendships had been developed through music therapy, that outreach partners really appreciated how hard we worked to get funding for them. But I didn't have the evidence for this to really properly share in applications. And kind of leading on for that, more and more, as I was talking to our grant funders, who constitute about 40% of our income, when I was talking to organizations like Arts Access, Aotearoa, they were really encouraging evaluation processes on applications and in reporting measures. And you know, while we're so careful to collect client data, we don't report on we don't correlate and report on that data in our grant applications. And I didn't feel like those service evaluations were meeting the standards that grant funders were looking for. And kind of lastly with that, at the same time that I was starting to have these questions, I was doing a lot of talking with Nordoff Robbins in Sydney about NDIS, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme that had recently at the time come into play in Australia and was funding music therapy there. And they were struggling a bit with fitting music therapy into this pre-existing model of reporting that felt quite medical. And it seemed to me like it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't go through a process in which we asked New Zealand families to identify what they valued about music therapy, with the hope that someday, when we have the opportunity to access government funding, we will have learned from the struggles other countries have had in fitting music therapy into an already existing model, and maybe be able to better state our value within a music therapy and New Zealand context. So those are really the motivators to start to go through this process. But I didn't want to complete the process ourselves. I really wanted to bring in an independent evaluation organization to do it. I knew that they would be independent, which would give more value to the outcomes. And I also knew that they would do this 1,000 times better than we could ever even begin to imagine doing it ourselves. So started working with Adrian on a grant request to Lotteries Community Sector Research, which was approved in March last year, March 2019. And it allowed for Dovetail to complete the kind of 10-month evaluation. It also allowed one of our therapists, Ollie Lowry, to work part-time on the evaluation team so that we could keep a lot of that knowledge in-house that was going to come from the project. And as I was saying to the webinar folks before we started, one of the requirements when you get a grant like this is that you disseminate the research to your community, to our music therapy community. So we're doing that tonight, which is great, but you can also find the full 80-something page report on the URL listed there. And Adrian and his co-researchers and Ollie and I have an article in the 2020 journal that'll be coming out that will also share some information about the project.
Thank you, Jen. And I just checked, it's 81 pages. You're quite right. I certainly was independent. I actually live just around the corner from their previous offices, and I wasn't really aware of very much about music therapy and didn't know of the trust at all when the centre opened. And it was certainly a journey of evolving knowledge for me in understanding music therapy, and that only deepened as we engaged with families and outreach partners. So I'll just talk a little bit about how we approached the evaluation. We spent a considerable amount of time up front developing an evaluation framework that really provided the roadmap for the evaluation. And part of the role of any framework is actually bringing the evaluators up to speed in understanding the goals of the organisation and what they're seeking to do and how they work. And I was working in this with my colleagues, Rachel Butler, Auckland-based social researcher, and Louise Ware, a Te Awamutu-based kaupapa Māori researcher, whose daughter also had a very strong lived experience of disability, and Louise was able to bring that own personal experience from her family into the evaluation as well. Rachel undertook an extensive literature review on current practice and outcomes in music therapy, and that's detailed in the report that Jen alluded to earlier. We undertook qualitative interviews with 21 families and one client, and we also did 9 interviews with outreach partners from around Auckland and more widely as well. We did an online and paper-based survey of current and previous families and caregivers who were clients of Raukatori. We also had a discussion group with staff to reflect on how COVID-19 was felt and the impacts it had on their service and how they adapted. This won't be so much a feature of this presentation today, but it is contained in the report. We also had a discussion group to reflect on how the principles of enabling good lives are reflected in the work of Raukatori. And throughout the course of the evaluation, we had an ongoing reflection with leadership about the findings as they unfolded. And finally, we had a session with staff. I think it was under level 3 lockdown, maybe level 2, but we were certainly all on Zoom to talk through the findings as they were coming through and before the final report was submitted. So just to give a little bit of detail of the people who took part. So we had 100 people taking part in a survey on participating in Raukatori. And just to show there, we had a nice mix of people who were had been with Raukatori either currently or previously, and the amount of time. So there's a nice mix of the length of time there, from 6 months or less, where a quarter took part, through to some who'd been with Raukatori for more than 5 years. And as I say, this was a mixture of current and previous clients. We also had a nice mixture of ethnic groups, perhaps a little bit underrepresented in Pacific, but we were pleased overall that there was some representation across a range of ethnic groups. In terms of the qualitative interviews, we had 20 taking part, and we got overall a really useful mix of people from the different regions as well as Auckland, Māori, migrant families, adult client families, people who had perhaps gave a lower rating of their experience of Raukatori or had left the service so that they could be part of the discussions as well as general client families as well. So, and one participant was really keen for us to interview her child to be part of it, and we talked through the processes with Raukatori and with the parent, and we were able to find a way that we could, in a very non-threatening way, have an interview about experiences there. Okay. Now, part of the tool of the trade of any evaluation is doing what we call a theory of change. And that's really mapping out the pathway through which the resources and the services flow through into outcomes and change for people. So this is a simplified diagram of the impacts. What's striking for me about the one I'm about to show you is that it was actually developed hand in hand with Raukatori's staff, and I think it might have even been Rachel, had a guiding hand in the final outcome of it. So this first column is what the typical evaluator does, which is a number of boxes. So first of all, we have things like the funding, the staffing and delivery that happens, and the music therapy processes, the way Raukatori works in terms of engaging with the centre and staff, matching with an appropriate staff member, assessing capabilities, having individualised session with goal setting, and also providing consultative support and helping people transition out. So those are sort of the way that Raukatori works. In a very, very generalised way, we can see that, the intention is that these flow through into outcomes for clients that include cognitive, physical, social, emotional, and communication outcomes. but also outcomes for families or caregivers in terms of their own participation, their own awareness of their children or their loved ones, their knowledge, their appreciation of their loved one, and their connection both to their loved one, but also to other families and whānau who may participate in Rokotōri. And we also understand that there are outcomes for the outreach partners, and these can be the impacts on the clients themselves, but also the way it can help the organisations who are outreach partners in delivering their own priorities. Now, what was special about this was at the end of it, we actually created a flow that went not just from outcomes, but into impacts. And this really came directly out of the conversation with Rokotōri staff. And this tree metaphor captures both the family impacts in dark green of things like appreciation, relationships, respite, support, community, but also the client impacts of things like connection, choice, control, relationships, and pride. And this is bound together by music therapy itself and the values that are held dear within Rokotōri of things like being client-centered, believing in the clients they're working with, trust, developing trust, creating joy, and really providing love in the work they do. So for us, it was really special that this final part of the theory of change was something that was crafted directly by Rokotōri and that they really guided themselves. So we had a series of overarching evaluation questions that really guided our work. And as we looked at all the findings that were coming through from the different sources that we had, we were really seeking to answer each of these questions. And so I'm just going to give some highlights of the findings here. So the first question was, in what ways do clients and families or caregivers value working with Rokotōri? We had some sort of standard questions about, how would you rate working with Rokotōri from family members? And there was some nice feedback there around, 2/3 rated as excellent and a further 28%, so over 90% in total rating it very good. But when we drilled into what was it that was most valued by the loved ones, by their family members, it was things like musical participation in and of itself, but also really strongly the relationship with the therapist, the opportunity for self-expression, the enjoyment of the sessions, and building relationships and interaction in the music therapy setting. You can also see below that a range of other aspects that were valued as well. So there was clearly the experience of Rokotōri was something that was really strongly valued here. And when we asked about what was valued most by family and caregivers, it was similar, not quite the same, but some similar themes coming through, particularly the relationship with the therapist or the team, the way their loved ones would enjoy the sessions, but also things like having a very tailored approach to the needs of each individual loved one, and also seeing the development of the loved one unfold. So things like musical participation were a bit further down the list, whereas at the top of the list in terms of the perception of how it was valued by loved ones. And on the right here, we've got some of the direct quotes from some of the parents or caregivers that we spoke with. Things like, I think this first one talks about somewhere that's a place of acceptance, where you don't have to apologize for all the little quirky, strange things that they do, because you're in an environment where people just understand instantly and they accept. Also, from one family member was the way in which Rokotōri staff would work with areas of interest and the cultural orientations. So this was a venue where te reo could be kept alive and could see that Rokotōri was supporting the language. And just simple things like looking forward to it, from the third quote. She's saying that this child is never too tired for Rokotōri. This diagram here is called a word cloud, and it was just going through those responses to what do family members value about Rokotōri and pulling out the most commonly appearing words. They take out things like va and so on. They really just focus on the notable words. And where you see things like kind, supportive, professional, confident, And then things like laughter and acceptance and so on. Those really echo the quotes and the feedback that we were getting in the previous diagram. I'm just conscious of time. I really will have to move through. Also, we asked outreach partners about what they value of Rokutōri. And there's a number of really interesting strands here. One is the easy fit with the delivery of services. Another is the way it's parallel and accessible to the services they offer, and supports people where standard verbal communication and therapeutic modalities might not be so suitable. Others talked about experiencing success in whatever form is valid for that person, seeing the needs of individual children, and also developing the skills of staff at the outreach centres as well. Another question we were looking at, which was subtly different, was the impacts of working with Rokutōri. Those are intertwined to some degree, but there were some different themes that were coming through here that I'll touch on as well. We asked, the extent to which participating in Rokutōri has benefited your child or children, your loved ones. And it's a similar response to the earlier graph I showed, where we had 2/3 saying it's either been very beneficial or reasonably beneficial to their children. And when we asked about how has it benefited your family or whānau as a whole, we've got almost half saying it's been very beneficial, and another 38% saying it's been reasonably beneficial. And we'll uncover some of the reasons for that shortly. It's also reflected in the previous responses as well. So where Rokutōri has made a difference for the loved one was in things like social functioning, the way that they would relate to people. There were some lovely quotes about how one child, when she saw a friend at school crying, sang a song for her in an empathetic way that hadn't happened before. The engagement with music, the self-expression that came through, building relationships and interaction with the team, engagement in communication, enjoying the sessions, and so on. So there's a lot of factors here where it's making a difference in the way in which loved ones are able to enjoy their lives more. And this is a similar sort of word cloud, not quite as flash as the previous one because it was done on different software. But what you can see here for the difference being made for loved ones was things like just engagement with music, learning, building confidence, the use of different instruments, the expression that's coming through. So we see in this too that there's some really strong patterns coming through of the way in which Rokutōri is appreciated. In terms of the impacts for loved ones, one quote here talks about a sense of peace, a sense of success, of feeling good about herself. Another one talks about how music is a way to express herself in ways that she can't normally. So this one talked about, why don't you just play what you're feeling? And so being able to use the techniques that she'd adopted in her sessions with Rokutōri was really helpful in the home environment. And taking and enabling choices in the sessions was something that families could see was being taken out of the music therapy room and into the home environment as well. Just making simple choices like, what would you like for breakfast this morning, which hadn't happened before and was giving people choice and control in a way that they hadn't seen. The sorts of things that were coming through that family members noted were things like strengthened social interaction, building support networks this is between different families at Rokutōri. So it creates connections for families that often feel quite isolated. They're building support networks among themselves, but it's actually helping improve family relationships as well, and giving at times just some respite, just that nice moment to be able to sit down and read a book while the loved one is in music therapy. Also things like access to information that the second quote talks to, and that sense of being respected, and that there's a place where some people really get him and he's attended to, and it's a supportive environment for them. Going back to what the outreach partners were saying, there were some lovely quotes, and this first one I think particular, and I did this interview, and she was slightly teary when she said this, but she said, When I've seen children who've just learned how to walk and they want to stand up and boogie on down, that gets me because I know the hard work that's gone into getting these children to take their first steps. And then for them to be able to stand up and boogie in a session, I'm like, well, that does it for me. Others were a little bit more distant in how they talked about it, was still enthusiastic though. So regulating emotions and finding ways to do that. Setting things up in a way that kids can be competent, and also the way that music therapy is able to help people be confident in themselves, and to create ways in which they can take that confidence to work with others and create something together in a way that they hadn't seen, or that other modalities aren't able to succeed. Okay, and this is sort of the factors that sustain participation, what works well about Raukatori, and we'll also go to what were the challenges that they experienced. The sorts of things that were really important to accessing music therapy services was simply, first of all, the enjoyment of the sessions. Clearly that was a huge factor in sustaining people going. But also the relationships with staff were raised by many. That the costs were kept as low as possible was noted by a third as well. We also, in talking with families and outreach partners, again, the strong client and therapist relationship was really powerful. But also the way in which transitions from one therapist to another was managed, so that although each therapist has their own individual style, the transition was handled so well that people were able to move to the new therapist generally, and it worked well. Financial assistance was mentioned, just the way in which there was flexibility to enable sessions to happen. And often raised by the outreach partners was the communication and professionalism of the team and the mutual respect between different professions. And of course, and as Jen raised in her introduction, there are challenges to participation as well, and there were areas of improvement that were highlighted. This wasn't all an entire good news story. It was a very substantially good news story, I would have to say. But yeah, there were challenges raised, and it was really helpful to hear them. The sorts of things that made it difficult to use the music therapy service was, for a large proportion of people, cost still was a factor. And distance from home was a factor. And when we talked more about it with families, some of the things that came up were a little bit surprising. So the initial entry to music therapy was seen as daunting, and they weren't really sure how to proceed with it. They obviously settled in, but those first few visits are a really important time to build trust. The process of goal setting and feedback was one that was raised by some as being an area that could be strengthened further. But it's been also in discussions with staff, it's been an ongoing area of it works for some people, it doesn't work for others, and constantly trying different approaches. So it's always a constant learning thing. Some people are just happy to bring their children or their loved ones in and have them enjoy a session and aren't too interested in the feedback, and others are looking for really structured feedback, and so finding a middle ground is always tricky. The logistics sometimes of getting to music therapy is something that was shared by many, and for a small number it was clear that the therapist-client relationship just didn't work out, or that it worked well with one but not another. By and large, though, the relationships were very strong, but clearly there were some cases where this didn't happen. And this is my last slide before I hand back to Jen. We also reflected on the principles of enabling good lives. For those of you who aren't aware, Enabling Good Lives is was a pilot program for individualised funding of services to people with disabilities. And it has built on individualised funding approaches used in other parts of the country, and trialled very intensively in the Waikato region, which my colleague Louise Ware was involved in leading the evaluation of that, in fact. So Louise brought into this a sense of the potential value that music therapy may offer enabling good lives, and she filtered that through the 8 principles that underpin enabling good lives. So I'm just going to grab a quick drink of water. that's better. So the 8 principles of enabling good lives are self-determination, being person-centered, building relationships, having ordinary life outcomes, working in the mainstream first, beginning early, being easy to use, and mana enhancing. I won't read all these out, but I think what we're able to find through both the survey and also through the interviews was that in many respects, the work of Raukatori and music therapy in general is really in line with enabling good lives. And should the program be able to be expanded more widely across the country, we think that there are some important parallels and linkages here between music therapy and the intent of enabling good lives, by things like giving people choice and control and artistic expression to help self-determination, providing individualized goals for people for being person-centered, working strongly on the relationship between the client and the therapist, and strengthening the relationships in an ongoing way, helping people to have ordinary life outcomes, engage socially, build better relationships with their whānau, working with clients across a range of needs, pushing their boundaries and their artistic expression. And then in terms of beginning early, it's fostering a place where abilities and expression is celebrated, working flexibly with clients and families so that they're easy to use, and being built on the belief that all people are capable of realizing and self-actualizing their own potential, so being mana enhancing. So that was a really, really, really rapid reflection on the findings coming through. And at this point, I'll hand back to Jen now to wrap up. Thank you.
I'll try to go even faster. So we've already made some immediate improvements to our service to build on that sense of community that parents were requesting, community and support. We've begun a series of informational parent carer workshops with the goal of featuring a different topic for each school term, and we're making those available via Zoom so that our families in the regional centers can stay connected with us. We've increased our family programming during the school holidays. One of the nicest things about the evaluation has already been that I could go out to one of our funders and say, families really want opportunities to come together in music therapy and to bring their siblings in. So would you give us some money for some school holiday programs? And IHC has kindly funded that. And we've been able to do more family programming during the holidays, as well as bringing back our Raukatori Tunes program, which we initially started as Quarantunes during the initial lockdown. And we've also already streamlined our reporting process, probably most significantly from the feedback. So our reports are now shorter, they're quarterly, and we've removed the cost from that reporting for families. And in addition, we've moved our service evaluation process to a survey, which Adrian put together for us, and that will be being done every 6 months. By both our families and our outreach partners, and Adrian very kindly will be collating that data for us for the next couple of years so that we can continue to monitor how our service is going. But probably more interestingly for all of you are kind of some reflections for the profession that came out of the process. So Adrian's going to go to the next slide for me now.
Oh, sure.
Thanks.
Okay.
So while international literature formed the foundation for the understanding of current music therapy practice in the evaluation report, the findings of the evaluation provided insight into the areas of growth most valued by caregivers engaging with the service in a New Zealand context. The identified impacts of music therapy were collated by thematic analysis of positive examples offered by caregivers, which allowed the caregivers the freedom to share their unedited perceptions of the domains in which they found music therapy to have the most impact. Other than engagement and communication, which indicates an improvement in expressive language skills, the themes that emerged most strongly of social functioning, musical engagement, self-expression, and building relationships really diverged from the areas most often cited as goal areas for music therapy. We're always talking about things like increased expressive language skills, improved motor functioning, enhanced cognition. To me, this indicated a sense from caregivers that music therapy acts as a source of holistic well-being, rather than a therapeutic approach which targets specific areas of need, as the ability to form relationships with others in which we can communicate our true selves and actively engage in creative expression are inherent to self-actualization. The caregivers are seeking this for their loved ones with disabilities, and finding it in music therapy is important information for registered music therapists to reflect upon as we design goals and report on our clients' progress. I think that further evaluation into whether the importance placed on relationship development and holistic well-being by Rokotari caregivers and outreach partners is that looking into it, whether that's indicative of the center-specific, client-centered practice that we focus on at the center, or whether it's representative of a national well-being focus that's grounded in the Te Whara Tapawha model of health, would provide an interesting collaborative project for New Zealand music therapists working in various settings. I also found it really interesting from a goal-oriented perspective that the second most commonly cited positive impact for clients was in the area of musical engagement. A common phrase that music therapists use is that we use music to achieve non-musical goals, but the report showed that many families were reporting musical engagement as an essential area of growth for their loved one. Interestingly, this is consistent with the 2020 service evaluation article by Nordoff Robbins UK that was just published, in which therapy participants ranked provides an opportunity to experience music as the most positive impact of music therapy, both for themselves and also a highly valued aspect of the service for their families. It appears that initial engagement with Rokotari service is largely driven by recognition that the client is drawn to music and by the caregiver seeking opportunities for musical engagement, rather than due to an understanding of the non-musical benefits of music therapy. But the sustained value that caregivers place on musical engagement is an important and welcome understanding for registered music therapists to have when communicating about their clients' development. Like parents and caregivers, while Rokotari's outreach partners often came to music therapy services with limited understanding of outcomes, they quickly grew to value the service and to have the utmost respect for the skill and the professionalism of the registered music therapists who they worked with. The complementary nature of music therapy practice at outreach sites was a consistent theme, despite the disparate nature of the surveyed facilities, which range from schools to corrections facilities to forensic mental health units. In addition, the seamless nature with which the registered music therapists were able to integrate into programs served as an indicator of the therapist's ability to work as valued members of interdisciplinary teams. Finally, I thought it was really interesting that the development of relationships was not only a valued outcome between client and therapist and between clients attending music therapy together, but it underpinned the value of Rokotari services in a variety of ways. Caregivers cited their own relationship with their loved one's therapist, as well as with the larger Rokotari team, as the aspect of the service that they valued the very most. In addition, many respondents focused on the service's ability to provide them with a larger community of people who understood the complex nature of caring for someone with a disability, and of the relief inherent in the non-judgmental environment that the music therapy centers provide. The genuine nature of the friendships that developed through music therapy between clients attending sessions together, between the client and therapist, and between families sharing the waiting areas emerged frequently in the evaluation, as did the rarity for Rokotari's families of finding a welcoming, accepting, comfortable space for them and their loved ones. The friendships between Rokotari caregivers, some of which have extended outside the therapy center, were cited as a source of both emotional and practical support. And I've got one more. So this is a need for advocacy, and this is not only emerged when our participants were talking about us, but also music therapists in general. So just some reflections on this. So despite the value recognized by our outreach partners, challenges around music therapy funding, and by extension, the importance of advocacy by Rokotari and the profession in general, were a constant refrain. No outreach interviewees challenged the fees that Rokotari charges, which are felt to be in line with the professionalism of the service. But funding music therapy was the only obstacle to outreach service delivery that emerged from the evaluation. While many outreach partners expressed appreciation for the funding efforts that the Trust makes on their behalf, there was a sense that there is an important role for the profession of music therapy and its supporters in challenging current funding structures and criteria so that the complementarity of approaches can be better leveraged. This is not only true in terms of advocating for increased funding, but also through the development of awareness of the service benefits, because outreach facilities often cited their inability to allocate discretionary funds towards music therapy due to a limited awareness of the field within their organization. Adrian famously spoke to someone at a corrections facility who said he'd love to spend the money on music therapy, but when it came down to music therapy versus mattresses, they made him spend the money on mattresses because they knew what mattresses were. Music therapy, not so much. Similarly, families expressed the need for music therapy advocacy by Rokotari for two fundamental reasons: to make more people with disabilities aware of a highly beneficial service and to create more consistent funding streams for music therapy in New Zealand. This two-pronged need for advocacy, a discussion that we've been having within our field long before this evaluation took place, is an ideal reason for registered music therapists to use the principles of enabling good lives to more explicitly frame their advocacy within the disability sector and communities. The Enabling Good Life principles are guiding the transformation of the National Disability Support System, and there are many disabled people, families, whānau, providers, and government agencies who operate and practice the Enabling Good Lives principles, creating an opportunity for a collective and shared movement. As Enabling Good Lives moves beyond regional trials to a projected national system, enhancing the understanding and value of music therapy, both with disability funding agencies and directly with disabled people and their families who will have the option to manage their disability funding budgets, is critical to enable access, choice, and control. And that's it.
Kia ora, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Adrian, for that comprehensive and really inspiring presentation. I'm particularly excited about the results in terms of how we can advocate for our clients and communities, because again, as you said, Jen, that's something that we have been doing and discussing within our profession for many, many years. So we have a comment from Daphne Ricks, and thank you so much, Daphne. She says, "Kia ora, very grateful for this mahi. The current findings of a music therapy project with children who have autism spectrum disorder have also aligned their findings with the Enabling Good Lives project, as well as the current autism spectrum disorder guidelines. So the publications for that project are in process. And it's exciting to see that similar findings are coming through. And I mean, when you were sharing those findings in terms of the importance for your families and communities, that was also what I'm finding in my own work. So it's exciting to see that reflecting across the profession. I'd like to open up the floor now, and by the floor I mean the chat or the Q&A box, for anyone who would like to make a comment or ask a question. We're very privileged to have Jen and Adrian give their time to us, so please do put those questions out there. Is there anything that that there wasn't time to put in the presentation that you would like to share with us? Maybe a personal reflection of this process for you, Jen or Adrian?
Well, I think one thing that was recurring to me as this unfolded was it's interesting working, this is more a reflection as an evaluator. One of the common challenges we face is going into a situation or an organization like this and needing to understand how a program works. And that's often a process of trust building, because we need to ensure that we're on the right wavelength with the delivery organization, and that the staff trust us and are confident that we understand what it is you're trying to do. but we also have to walk that careful walk of being a step removed and being able to offer the advice and the findings that may not always be welcome. In this case, the findings were overall really, really positive, but it's for me, it's really gratifying to see the way that Rokotori has so proactively taken on the feedback that came through the evaluation and has adapted service delivery in the way that you have. So, my congratulations there, really, I think would be my reflection, Jen.
Thank you. And I guess, probably like all music therapists, one of the things for us certainly that we had to be really careful about was, we had to find people who we knew we'd be really comfortable, going out to our families. Our families are already, for the most part, so busy and very, overwhelmed often by all of their obligations, and their time is so valuable. But, from the second we started working with Adrian and Rachel and Louise, we just knew that it would actually be a really positive experience for our families to get to really engage with them and tell their stories. And so we were really appreciative of how much care and consideration that was handled with.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've had a question about, have you considered where else you might publish your findings beyond the music therapy profession and publications such as this webinar or the Journal of Music Therapy, which I think probably relates to the sense of advocacy that we are strongly feeling. So any thoughts on where to from here in terms of sharing this very valuable research?
I'd be really happy. I'd be really excited to have some ideas from people about places where that would be of value. And we'd be very open to, I think something that I reference in the journal article is I'd be really interested again in having this be kind of a jumping off point to looking at our profession within in full. So I don't believe that these findings are specific to our practice at Rokotori. I think that there's probably a lot of generalization to how other people are seeing their work. But I think there would be so much more value in this being a collective movement if we were looking at it across the country. As therapists working throughout New Zealand. And so I'd be really pleased to work with other people on looking at how these findings might relate to their practice as well, and maybe do some further study. And I think Ali sent some ideas, so that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Just a comment from another participant. It's so valuable. Thank you for sharing. And the comment that we get that music therapy is using music for non-musical goals, because this person has used that many times, as have I. It's music for non-musical goals, but it's a nice reminder and it's thought-provoking that people come to music therapists because, quote unquote, they like music or their child likes music, and that's actually the draw. They're looking for that musical engagement, and that I think was really reflected. So thank you, Kim, for that comment. And we have one more question from someone who's interested about the impact of COVID-19 and the shutdown on your research. Obviously, this is quite pressing. So was there a big halt or pause in your data collection process during the initial hit of COVID in New Zealand in March, April? Or was it quite easy to transfer this and transition to a work from home setting? How was that process?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. We did take a little bit of a pause because we knew that families were readjusting, and we didn't want to overload them with, hey, we want to come and talk to you about Rokotori while you're all busily creating a whole new routine. That said, there were quite a number of things that were very well advanced by the time COVID hit. So the survey was already completed, and I think it was substantially analysed by then. But yeah, we were still finishing off the parent caregiver and outreach interviews. And I can well remember one outreach interview that was done, I think the day before lockdown, as she was from home and she was basically not able to carry out her work at a hospital because of all the restrictions that were coming up. So in a way, it was kind of well timed because she didn't have much on because of COVID. So we then waited a week or two before we then started reapproaching the last of the families that we needed to interview, and we finished them up in probably the second 2 or 3 weeks of lockdown. And by that stage, they were settled in, and actually, with so many people at home, they were actually really happy to talk. And interestingly, I do recall that one family said that Rokitōri were the first provider to get in touch with them post-lockdown, or as lockdown happened, and just how important that was to them, and things like, I didn't touch on this in the presentation, things like quarantines were really well appreciated. And the other thing that struck me too, when we talked with Rokitōri staff towards the end of lockdown, was just how quickly, as an organisation, they adapted and created new service offerings, created online individual and group outreach, did quarantines. It still had its impacts, there's no denying that, and there were some families that struggled to be able to be reached. But yeah, the adaptation shown by Rokitōri staff in this was really striking. And one said it didn't really seem to me as a surprise, because it's just our natural way of working. We're always in the moment in our work. We're always adapting as we work with clients, and this is just adapting at a bigger scale. I thought that was really striking too.
Thank you, Adrian. We have another question from an ECE teacher. Welcome, Jennifer. So she is wondering if there's any scope for research being implemented in collaboration with ECE learning spaces. So hopefully we'll contact you soon, Jennifer. So Jennifer uses music because she knows the value of it for its open nature. It gets responses from children and whānau. It's interesting and varied sensory processing time of life. So obviously in early childhood, it's lots and lots of sensory processing. So any thoughts about collaboration?
Absolutely. Well, Jennifer, it's exciting that you're on this chat, because one of the biggest projects that we've been working on for the past 12 months has been a joint project with the Ministry of Education in Northland, which has been one of our therapists, Katie. I was about to say Katie Boom, and she's gotten married. Katie and her dance movement therapy colleague, Jan, have been traveling around the far north. This first 9-month part of that project has been working with 15 early childhood centers across the far north on tools for emotional regulation, particularly within kind of a trauma-informed care way of looking at working with the tamariki. So they go into the early childhood centers and they provide workshops for the staff, they provide workshops for the whānau, and they also work directly with the children on teaching them really simple music and movement tools for emotional regulation. And Katie and Jan are actually going to be presenting as part of Music Therapy Week in about a week and a half. They're going to be doing not a webinar, but like a workshop, an online workshop. You can do it either in person in Whangarei if you're in Northland, or you can do it via Zoom. If you go to our website, you can sign up for that, and they'll be talking about their early childhood work on emotional regulation. And starting in November, again, if you're in Northland, I don't know where you are, but starting in November, they'll be rolling out the second phase of that, and this time working with 15 early childhood centers in Whangarei this time. And one of the things that I have found to be really cool is that during this time when the schools have been able to access this Ministry of Ed Urgent Relief Fund for COVID, my very first call about that funding was from an early childhood center in Auckland. And I think probably between Northland, Auckland, and Hawke's Bay, we've probably had 10 early childhood centers reach out to us about accessing music therapy through that fund. So early childhood centers have really been at the forefront of trying to get music therapy in through that funding, and it's been really cool to see.
I can just add to that, one of the interviewees we spoke to said, who works with children with both developmental and physical disabilities, spoke of how music therapy was a place that was a leveler where children could celebrate together in a way that they struggled to in other settings in the centre. So it was an interesting way in which, music therapy was this unifying force, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. I am just aware of the time, so we have 1 minute left. I'm going to check and make sure all our questions have been answered. Jen, if you wouldn't mind letting us know where on your website we can find the information to sign up for those workshops. I just had a quick look, but it wasn't immediately obvious, so that would be great. If you could just let us know where that is.
Absolutely. Oh, right this second. I thought.
Oh, no, that's fine. Perhaps we could
I can
get
have
that
a look
information. We can get that information out to the
that would be great. And it is it's part of Music Therapy Week for Music Therapy New Zealand. We'll have workshops in Auckland and in Northland. So, but yeah, I'll make sure we get it to you.
Thank you so much. Well, that's actually segued nicely into my closing, which is that we look forward to Music Therapy Week, which is from the 19th to the 25th of October. And there are a number of online events, workshops and webinars you can sign up for. So we do encourage you to visit the Music Therapy New Zealand website and find that information and sign up for those. Thank you so much, Sophie. We do appreciate that link. Thank you. Sophie is on our Music Therapy Week working group. So thank you so much for your work, Sophie. And thank you so much to Adrian and to Jen for that inspiring presentation. I've got so much going on for me now that I'm going to go away and process and think, how can I better serve my clients and my families in whānau in the future? So there are still a number of events available for Music Therapy Week coming up. Please do sign up for those. Thank you to the team, the Music Therapy Week Working Group and the Research SIG teams who made this possible, and thank you to Music Therapy New Zealand. So Paul Marie and good evening all. Kia ora. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Adrian and Jen.
Thank you.